So with that, yeah, like this, the idea of this presentation is actually to explore like what are the differences between the different business models.
No, I'm good. I've got another 10 minutes or so, but may I have another, may I have a nitwit? Yeah, it's lighter. Yeah, thank you.
Sounds like one of our previous speakers. Let's see if we can help them out here. There we go.
Okay. Okay. So what are we talking about? In here, like, I mean, of course, like there's a spectrum of the different business models that you can use, right? On one end, you have like, you can go all SVOD. On the other end, you can all depend on advertising revenue. Of course, like their platforms are kind of like doing a little bit of both. But for the purpose of this analysis, what we have done is like, we have like made like SVODs, like only those that really just depend on subscription revenue with no ad. So that would be our definition of SVODs for this analysis. And AVODs is like any network that at a certain, I mean, it depends on some point on like ad supported services. So this is kind of like the sample of networks that we're using. And we're using this, I mean, I think the motivation of actually addressing this question is like, when you look at the different, you know, what's really out there and what people are thinking about, people are questioning these business models, right? Like for the longest time, I think Netflix has, I mean, like people are questioning why Netflix doesn't jump into ads, you know? So that's one thing that is, you know, has been, you know, on the press. On the other end, you have like, more recently, you have like Warner Media saying that they're gonna go into or open an AVOD tier, and the same with Paramount Plus, right? So in a way, this is like exploring these business models is something that is like, is current and is something that I think a lot of people wanna know about. And like the purpose of this presentation is to see what the data says in terms of like, you know, what works for which business model, you know? For that, we have the advantage of like looking at the world from the optics of audience demand and content supply. And really what that means is like, you know, at Parrot, we track like thousands of titles. All of these titles, we know where the title is present. And then at the same time, we also track how consumers are interacting with those titles, anything from a Google search to a comment on Facebook, to a retweet, to even like downloads on piracy or like a visualization of a YouTube trailer. All of that is being captured by our system. And we have a way to then convert that into, you know, like thinking about like the attention economy, how does that translate into demand, right? And combining the two things, then like we're able to answer questions, right? Like the idea here is like, this is an environment where you can actually track supply and track demand. By tracking both of these elements, and like this is gonna give you insights to some of the questions that you may have. If you think about like applying that to the different SVODs, in this case that we're using, you can think of this as like, you know, essentially each of these platforms will have a certain amount of titles. Each title in here is represented by a dot or an X. And the position of the dot or the X really basically signals how popular it is or what is the demand that that title has. What we have seen in the market is like there's like a natural distribution occurring, which essentially allows us to classify content across 5 quadrants, which are the 5 quadrants that you see there. And at the top of the quadrant is anything that is above 32 times as popular as the average title. And that's only like about 0.2% of the titles actually reach to that level. But in any case, like this is a good way to basically bring visibility into all of these like, you know, like portfolios of content that, you know, or bundles of content that these platforms offer. So this is on the SVOD side. We're looking at the 2020 demand, and this is going to be the basis of our analysis. And then on the AVOD side, again, like you're looking at the 2020, you know, full year results. Again, looking at all the titles that they have and like how popular they are. So this gives you, again, like a quick perspective of like, what is the positioning of each of these platforms, you know, like in terms of like, what is the supply of content that they bring to the table, and also what is the level of demand that each of these titles is getting. So with that, really what we want to do now, once that we know that this is like our sample data using supply and demand, what we want to know is like essentially looking at how these different business models are using different levers that they have to create value, right? So in this case, we're going to look at exclusivity. We're going to look at foreign content, what happens with all libraries, and also like what is the type of programming that works where. And we're also going to look into win-to-win. So let me jump right away into exclusivity. What we see here is like, in general, our intuition is like, exclusive titles are better suited for SVODs. That's really like, we have that perception. We wanted to test that. When we look at the data, we look at the supply, we look at the demand. On the supply side, yes, we see that SVODs, or like 63% of the titles on SVODs are actually exclusive titles, which is like, it makes sense. I mean, like that's what we kind of were expecting. We may even like thought that it was going to be a little bit higher, but that's expecting. And then on the demand side, we see that more than 50% of the demand that they're getting is actually coming from these exclusive titles. And again, in here, that's what we were expecting. In any case, it really signals that the non-exclusive content is also important, right? Because like the exclusive content can only take you to 52% of the demand. The rest of the demand is going to come from like all of these titles that they have to license, and these are titles that may be licensed across like different platforms. On the AVOD side, we actually see that, again, like we have this perception that maybe AVOD is more like, all of these licensed titles that may be everywhere. And that, yeah, it is. Obviously, there's more of that. You see that, like in terms of demand, like 60% of the demand is coming from that. But they also have their own exclusive, right? And I think it's like using like both as an element to differentiate yourself is really what's key. And that's kind of what we're seeing in here. So really what this means is like exclusive content can really serve a purpose for both. It's obviously more important for SVODs, but really serves a purpose for both. The next thing I want to explore is all the library content. When we're thinking about all the library content, we may think maybe AVODs are ideal for that, especially when we're talking about like long tail content. And we wanted to test that. When we look at the data, again, looking at supply, demand, yes, it confirms a little bit of that intuition. Like we see AVODs, actually the supply or the offering of titles that are like already concluded. So like series that have finished already, 2/3 of those, 2/3 of the total titles are actually in those series that have already finished, which is higher than like what SVOD may have. In terms of the demand, in both cases, about 44% of the demand is coming from these like series that have finished. And again, I think this confirms a little bit our intuition, but again, from the SVOD perspective, it seems like these series that have finished are still important. It's like it's still driving 40% of the demand. So again, like I think this element may be more important for AVODs, but it could also be important for SVODs. And in the case of AVODs, especially when you look at the difference between supply and demand, you realize like, yeah, that AVODs may be the home for those series that may attend more like the long tail. So that actually confirms that as well. So that's interesting. The next thing I want to jump into is foreign content. In here, like we wanted to understand like if foreign content has like any type of sort of preferred home, when we're looking at the different business models. We did analysis, and it actually seems like, it's pretty similar, basically, I guess like a little bit of the surprise that we got here is like, we see that the amount of foreign titles is actually a lot higher than like, at least I thought, we would see. It's almost close to 50% of the titles. Yeah, and this is consistent across like SVODs and AVODs, so it's actually pretty interesting. And again, and the demand obviously is not as high as the domestic content, but still it provides like, an important element. In any case, in this case, one of the things that we realize is like doing this analysis by group may actually hide a lot of differences. And that's why we wanted to go a little bit further, because like we see that really there's a huge variance depending on like what is the platform that you're talking about. So just looking at their catalogs and looking at the percentage of foreign content that they have, again, like the blue ones are like what we categorize as AVODs, and the red ones are the SVODs. But you see like a wide distribution, right? So in certain cases, you know, for the AVODs, like you have like Rakuten Viki, for example, that for them is like, obviously that's their value proposition, right? Like they provide Korean content to US audiences. So that's reflected in there. And then in some of the SVODs with global presence, I think, you know, it sort of reflects the fact that they go after global rights, right? So whenever they get like a series, they're always thinking from a perspective of a global presence. So that's why you see like a high percentage of their catalog is actually foreign titles. And in terms of how effective this type of content it is, again, it doesn't surprise things, but like in the case of AVODs, you know, for these two AVODs, like that type of content is actually driving most of the demand, right? So that's the value proposition. That's what makes sense for them. In the case of SVODs, there's a gap between like what the supply and the demand is. What we're seeing is like actually this gap is actually closing. So especially after the pandemic started, I think you know, audiences are getting more exposed to international content, and their demand for this international content is actually growing. Still, there's a big gap between like what the supply and the demand is. But let's see how this is gonna work out like down the road, because we see that gap as closing. So the next area I want to jump into is more about like what is the type of programming that is more prevalent in where. So for that, again, like what we see here, just looking at the catalog, you know, per se, just looking at the number of titles, we compare like the percentage of titles that kind of fit into each of these different type of programming. And then we see some programming that is more overrepresented for AVODs, some type of programming that is more overrepresented for SVODs. And what we find, again, it kind of like, it makes sense in a way. We see that realities in general are more represented on AVODs. And to me, I think that's also signals the fact that realities are easier to monetize via ad sales or brand integration. While on the other hand, you have like things like children and documentaries that may not be as easily monetized through ad sales, but at the end, it gives you elements that are very important to actually attract subscribers in the case of children, and actually retain subscribers in the case of documentaries. So like really, I mean, again, in here you start seeing like, what is the type of programming that works for what, you know? If we go a little bit deeper to also understand the demand, again, like this kind of like makes sense in you know, you look at the realities, you look at the supply and the demand. When you're looking at AVODs, you know, like 16% of all titles on AVODs are reality titles, but it actually 18% of the demand is coming from those titles. So in what we see here, there's like what we call an attention surplus. And really what this means is like the reality titles that are on AVODs are doing well or better than like some of the other titles that they offer. And if we look at the same perspective on the SVOD side, we actually see the opposite, right? So it makes sense, you know, like realities are kind of like a better fit for like AVODs, and that's what the demand actually is showing. We did this analysis also for drama. Interesting enough, in the case of SVOD, like there's like a complete match between supply and demand. In the case of AVODs, there's a difference, right? Like, and there's more supply than demand. And really what this means is like a lot of the drama titles are available in AVODs, maybe drama titles that may target like the long tail, right? So that may not, you know, it's like in terms of like the average demand that they generate may not be as high as a regular title. The last thing that we wanted to explore in this case, we also looked at action and adventure. We see this as a really important, playing like a really important role for like SVOD. So And again, like this is not surprising, like Mandalorian is really, has been such a success for Disney Plus that has driven like a lot of subscriptions. So this type of programming, like action and adventure, is actually very useful for SVODs, but it's also very useful for AVODs as well. So like it's interesting that in this case, we see this type of programming working on both. So the last thing I want to cover is about windowing, and I think what's interesting in here, I wanted to show. I mean, I guess like if you have especially for 16 libraries of content, if you want to expand the audience of a specific title, is it better to have it on an AVOD window, or is it better to have it on a SVOD window? And what we did here, we find like specific cases. So for example, we looked at The Office. Used to be on Netflix on January 1st or January 31st of this year, actually transferred to Peacock. No, January 1st, right? January 1st. And then like when that happened, what we see right away was a jump in the demand. So signaling that, I mean, again, like you're exposing this like all-time classic to like a different type of audience. So that's driving more demand, is becoming more popular. So in this case, like this is actually a gain for the title. We also explore the case of Modern Family. It actually shifted from, being present on Hulu on not really like all the seasons, but like on like the next day basis to a licensing where it is available in Hulu still, but also is available on Peacock. And again, like just adding that extra outlet of having the availability on Peacock actually is driving the demand of this title. We like 26%. So again, like this is another indication that you add another distribution is adding demand. So just to keep in mind in terms of like how to maximize the audience of a specific title. And then the next one and the last one I want to cover is like what happens if we go the opposite way, right? If we go from an AVOD to SVOD. And in this case, we have the example of Cobra Kai. So let me see. So in the case of Cobra Kai, it actually shifted from YouTube Premium to Netflix. And right away, you see like a big bump on Netflix just of the old seasons. But other than that, and then like they also launched a new season, right? So you see like, I mean, I think Netflix strategy was like pretty smart in that sense. It converted into a Netflix original. But again, like you see now, like the title is being exposed to a wider set of users, and then like its popularity is just going through the roof. So I think windowing could be like a nice strategy to actually drive value for a specific content. And then especially with the questions that a lot of these networks are having of how to implement like an AVOD tier, this is something that we're going to be able to see even more, because like then you're going to be able to test what happens when like the AVOD tier comes into place, and what is the impact that has on the audiences of a specific titles. And it's exciting. I think, I think at the end of the day, all of these levers that I showed today basically are elements that you can use to build both businesses. And even though like in all cases, it seems like there's a use for each of the business models, they may have different impact. And the idea here is to actually test to see what works or where, So with that, I want to end with an invitation to actually visit our product, Demand 360 Lite, which essentially you can actually access a lot of this data, more than 10,000 shows in 38 markets. You can see hundreds of platforms really being displayed there. So lots of like useful info. So that you guys get a better sense of where like the market is going and like what are the trends that are shaping up. With that, I want to thank again like Mark, Eric, for the invitation, and I think this is always like a great place to have this type of discussion. And I look forward to having the research roundup session like later today, especially for people who want to know more about like some of the data that we use for these and what are the implications.